Hello, everyone. I want to remind everybody that this event that we have today with Dr. Steven Pinker is Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online, organized by the Brazilian Linguistics Association, Abralin, in cooperation with the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, the Argentinian Society of Language Studies, the Linguistics Society of America, the European Linguistics Society, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistics Society. So this is truly a global event. Thank you very much for being here with us. My name is Siddhartha Ribeiro. I'm a neuroscientist at the Brain Institute of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, Brazil. And it's my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Steven Pinker today. He needs hardly an introduction, right? Everybody knows him very well, I'm sure. He's an experimental psychologist who conducts research in visual cognition, psycholinguistics, and social relations. He grew up in Montreal and earned his BA from McGill and his PhD from Harvard. Currently, Johnston Professor of Psychology at Harvard, he has also taught at Stanford and MIT. He has won numerous prizes for his research, his teaching, and his many books, including The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and The Sense of Style. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Humanist of the Year, a recipient of 9 honorary doctorates, and one of Foreign Policy's World Top 100 Public Intellectuals and Time's 100 Most Influential People in the World Today. He writes frequently for the New York Times, The Guardian, and other publications. His 10th book is called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Dr. Pinker, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I would like to start with a question related to the notion of instinct. The conception of language as a kind of instinct was first articulated by Darwin himself. His observations are indeed quite modern. Darwin concluded that the language ability is an instinctive tendency to acquire an art, a design that is not peculiar to humans, but seen in other species, such as song-learned birds. But one of Darwin's followers, William James, argued that we have all the instincts that animals do, and many more besides. Our flexible intelligence comes from the interplay of many instincts competing. How have the ideas of Darwin and James inspired your work?
Well, I work in a building called William James Hall, and my wife is a novelist, Rebecca Goldstein, wrote a novel where she made William James a character. And I have quoted William James in many, I think maybe all of my books. So I have a particular affinity for William James. He is also one of the best writers in, not just among psychologists, but perhaps in the history of the English language. They're witty and articulate and clear. So I'm a big fan of William James, together with, of course, Charles Darwin. So James wrote very little on language. But he was, in a sense, the first evolutionary psychologist, in that he took Darwin's ideas about evolution, complex structure seriously, and applied them to human psychology. He's sometimes called a functionalist in psychology textbooks because he asked of human psychological abilities, what are they for? What are they useful for? And indirectly, why did they? So Darwin, in a quote that formed the basis of the title of my book, he said, "Man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, while no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write." That gave me the idea for the title, the language instinct. But you're right that it was William James who applied it more than Darwin did to human psychology.
Thank you. So language is not a cultural artifact that we learn the way we learn to tell time or how the federal government works. Instead, it's a distinct piece of the biological makeup of our brains. Language develops in the child spontaneously without conscious effort or formal instruction, is deployed without awareness of its underlying logic, is qualitatively the same in every individual, and is distinct from more general abilities to process information or behave intelligently. For these reasons, some cognitive scientists have described language as a psychological faculty, a mental organ, a neural system, and a computational module. However, you have preferred the term instinct. How do these descriptions relate?
Yeah, so I chose the word instinct because it has the biological flavor, and because there's no technical definition of instinct, it allowed me to use it to try to explore what is and what is not innate about language, which is a very difficult question to answer, as we see in the fact that almost 60 years after Noam Chomsky first formulated a modern version of the idea, we still can't give a precise answer to the question. So instinct is a deliberately vague term. I certainly like it more than the notion of module, which was made famous by the late philosopher Jerry Fodor, because the idea of an encapsulated box in the brain, I think, is unrealistic. Language has to connect richly with other parts of the mind for it to be useful. Language has to connect, obviously, to perception, to the ears for hearing people, and for the eyes, both for signers and for literate people. It has to connect to systems of production, articulation, in the case of spoken language, manual gestures, writing. It has to connect to knowledge, because we not only access our knowledge of a particular language unconsciously when we speak, but we talk about stuff we know. We have a message in mind that we want to convey to other people. So language has to have an interface with our long-term knowledge and our current intention, what we want to talk about. And language also has to, of course, interface with our social cognition, because language is used in social interaction. We don't want to offend people or insult people. Sometimes we do, but we don't want to do it accidentally. We can't say everything that we want the other person to think, because then it would take an hour just to ask someone to pass the salt. So we have to leave a lot of things out, and to do that, we have to anticipate the mental state of our listener. That's why so much of language is indirect, and it uses politeness and euphemism and innuendo. So the summary is that language has to have feelers in many directions: perception, production, knowledge, intention, social interaction, short-term memory, so that we can remember how we began a sentence in order that we can complete it grammatically. That's why I don't like the term module for language. Instinct, because it's vaguer, allows us to take it as an empirical question. What is and what isn't innate about language?
Thank you. Moving on, many reduce the language discussion into the dichotomies of heredity environment, let's say nature nurture, nativism empiricism, innate acquired, biology culture, frequently invoking the image of a swaying pendulum of scientific fashion. Others tend to see that this controversy over whether heredity, environment, or some interaction between the two causes behavior is just incoherent. What view would you side with when considering the relationship between the human mind and human nature?
Yes, it's clearly a dichotomy. Is it learned, or is it acquired, innate? Is it nature or nurture? Is it biology? Is it culture? Is not a useful way to understand how language works. And in fact, many people in the nature-nurture debate actually cite language itself as proof of that, because obviously we are not born speaking any particular language. We don't have an instinct for Portuguese or English or Yiddish or Japanese. So language is not innate in that sense. On the other hand, it is also true that every human learns to speak a language, whereas our house pets don't. And even species that are close to us, like chimpanzees, have not, despite many years of teaching, acquired anything like a human language. So something is innate. It's not Portuguese, it's not English, it's not Spanish. What is it? Now, again, Chomsky formulated a modern version of the hypothesis of language as an instinct, proposed his universal grammar as something that is more abstract than the grammar of any particular language, but that captures the computational machinery that is necessary for a child to acquire a language. The sad fact is we don't really have a detailed characterization of what universal grammar is, even after 50 or 60 years. But I tend to think that that should be the major goal of linguistics, to try to capture exactly what is wired into the child that makes language acquisition possible.
Another one, explicit pedagogy, learning by being told, is one kind of general purpose learning, but most would agree it is the least effective. Most learning takes place outside of classroom lessons by generalizing from examples. Children generalize from role models or from their own behaviors that are rewarded or not rewarded. The learning seems to come from the generalization according to similarity and frequency instead of from the deliberate act of teaching. How does this idea relate to how learning has been understood and teaching has been practiced at schools?
Yes, well, we know from, I'm a university professor. I like to think that I'm teaching material to my students, but the depressing fact is that when you do tests of knowledge, tests of critical thinking, before and after a university course, usually there's surprisingly little knowledge that has been transmitted. This is just general results from university courses. And a lot of the reason is that even when it comes to explicit verbal material, knowledge of history or physics or biology, simply hearing propositions, hearing facts is generally not enough to result in lasting knowledge. The student has to actively connect the facts that they hear to a larger database. They have to process it deep at the level of meaning, not at the level of actual words. Usually they have to actively understand the material. It's good if they can rephrase it in their own words, if they use it to solve problems. A crude analogy is that if you have a website with no links, no matter how good the website is, it may as well not exist. And likewise, a piece of knowledge, unless it is woven into the mind wide web, our entire database of knowledge is useless. So pedagogy in general has to go beyond language in the sense of the words that we use to convey concepts to active understanding and integration. In the case of learning a language, where of course we don't teach children the rules, I mean, sometimes in school they do for a second language. That's not the most effective way to teach a second language. It is the active effort to use the language, to communicate often with peers, that is the most effective way to teach a second language. And of course, for a first language, no one gets lessons.
Thanks. Considering the assumption of an innate language faculty, the human being is equipped with what it takes to develop languages. The language acquisition theory assumes we are endowed with universal principles common to all human languages and parameters to account for language variation among the world's languages. The notion of what a parameter is has changed considerably over the years, with some authors even suggesting that there are no parameters whatsoever. How do you see this issue in terms of language development? Isn't denying the existence of parameters of some sort denying the very existence of a predisposition to language acquisition or development? Wouldn't it send us back to the time when one would have to believe a child is a little genius in language decodification? How do you see this debate, and what would you suggest could be a good research program to look at this question?
Well, the notion of a parameter has two meanings. There's just the technical definition in mathematics of a variable, something that makes one language different from another. And in the case of linguistics, the empirical fact that justifies speaking about parameters is that often many things correlate in variation from one language to another. such as if the language has a verb before the object, it'll have a preposition before a noun. If it has the verb after if it has the verb after the object, it will have a postposition of a noun, then the particle, the postposition. So the fact that there are these correlations has been characterized in terms of parameters. And since it's probably not a coincidence, it suggests that when a child acquires one fact about a language, it is not a little atom that just gets added to a database, but it kind of sets the pattern for their knowledge of the other parts of the language. So that's a very descriptive, literal use of the word parameter. In linguistics, it was used starting in the 1980s in Chomsky's theory of government and binding, which in its strong form proposed that language acquisition pretty much consists of nothing but setting a small number of parameters. Is the language head first or head last? Are subjects obligatory or can they be dropped? And that if a dozen or two parameters were set, then together with vocabulary, that's language acquisition. Now, it turned out that I don't think that anyone succeeded in reducing language acquisition to the setting of a few parameters. And one attempt, very ambitious attempt, was Mark Baker's book, The Atoms of Language. But when I asked Mark, are we eventually, it seems that every few months there's a new parameter. Is the list going to keep growing and growing and growing? In which case the theory is not particularly useful, because it's only if there's a short list of parameters that the parameter setting theory can explain language acquisition. He said, no, it could keep growing indefinitely. And I thought, oh, geez, I don't think that theory is going to work very well. And indeed, I think it has been abandoned, even by people within the Chomskyan camp who first proposed the theory. So you don't hear so much about parameter setting as a theory of language acquisition anymore. And that's probably because I'll add that there is a enormous amount of learning of particular vocabulary items. Well, we always knew that. No one, except for Jerry Fodor, perhaps, would say that you learn that 50,000 words and their meanings are innate. But putting that aside, we know that there has to be a huge amount of learning for vocabulary, and that there's probably a lot of learning of constructions and idioms and phrase types, and a great deal of language acquisition is going to have to be explained by the acquisition of particular items, not just setting a dozen parameters. Those items, crucially, have variables in them. It's not just memorizing sounds, it may be memorizing patterns, like the fact that the verb put requires in English, requires an object and a prepositional phrase or a locative phrase. But you're not just learning the sound of put, you're learning noun phrase, locative phrase, and that's very abstract. So a lot of the learning still is going to require abstract linguistic elements, but it does unmistakably involve learning of particular items, not just parameters that span the entire language. And may even be true for constructions like the more you eat, the fatter you get. It's an example from Ray Jackendoff. It's someone who knows English knows that pattern. The more you X, the more you Y. There are probably hundreds, maybe thousands of those idioms in the language. And perhaps that even applies to even more abstract bits of knowledge, like the structure of a verb phrase is a verb followed by a noun phrase followed by an optional complement. Ray Jackendoff has proposed a theory of language in which children acquire a large inventory of rules, idioms, words, each of which has a different mixture of actual lexical content, a particular word like put or go, and abstract slots like symbols for phrases.
So just to close this, so you don't think that there should be a research program on parameters?
No, I didn't say that. No, there should be a research program on grammars.
So how would that? How would you consider it to be most fruitfully pursued?
I think it should look for an intersection of two different bodies of research. One of them would be patterns of diversity across the world's languages, including the extreme cases where you don't have a millennia of accumulation of idiosyncrasies, as in the case of a language like English or Portuguese, in cases of relatively new languages like creoles and sign languages that are perhaps closer to the psychology of acquiring a language, but should also look at the full range of the thousands of languages that have been documented. And so to see what is a possible human language, what are the statistical patterns, what is never found or rarely found, what is always found. And this, of course, has been going on for decades, the study of language universals. I think that research ought to be more quantitative, more data-based. There should be a large data set of patterns in the world languages, so that when we make a generalization, we could say 100% of languages, we could say 97% of languages, we could say 33% of languages, taking into account, of course, the fact that languages are not independent. If you have English and Dutch and German and Icelandic, in a sense, those aren't 4 data points, but they're kind of 1 data point, and you have to take that into account. But then combine it with the kinds of generalizations that children make. What kind of jumps did kids make in their errors, in the sentence types that they produce, even if they've never been exposed to them, and to try to zero in with the intersection of what are the patterns of children's learning, what is the variation in existing languages, to try to zero in on what are the innate information processing abilities that allow language to be learned.
In the language instinct, you bring the story of the blind man palpating the elephant to illustrate how we sometimes deal with the language system, trying to focus on several aspects instead of the bigger picture. In that sense, how does the debate over formalism versus functionalism, or syntax versus semantics versus pragmatics, illustrate the knowledge of how language works?
Yes, I hope that those are not continuing debates, because they are all false dichotomies. Language has syntax and semantics. The reason we have syntax is so that we can convey meaning. It's got form in order that we implement its function, namely communication or memory. So these are, I mentioned these in the preface of my book, The Language Instinct, which came out 26 years ago, just to say that it's not constructive, it's not useful to have these dichotomies.
So now we're going to move a little bit away from linguistics and into more speculative realms and political realms, please. First, I want to ask you if you could comment a little bit on whether Julian Jaynes, of Julian Jaynes' seminal book on consciousness, has any relevance for your thoughts whatsoever, and if it has, why?
I have to confess that I didn't read the Julian Jaynes' famous book, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Certainly he's using the word consciousness in a different sense than psychologists would. If I'm awake and not asleep, if you prick me, I feel pain. If you put something that's red in front of me, it looks red. That's usually what we mean by consciousness. I'm conscious. I don't think my laptop computer is conscious. I don't think a rock is conscious. Jaynes was using it in a different sense. And I suspect that he proposed a more radical break between modern people and the ancient people that he spoke about than would really be justified.
Thank you. Along the same lines, but going further towards the past, what is the place of Persian semiotics in your mind? Well,
Peirce made some critical distinctions, introduced a vocabulary for thinking about the very notion of a symbol, which is useful. It's useful, for example, in making sense of the distinction between animal calls and human language. So it was important in its own time. I mean, it only goes so far, but it was certainly a useful start.
Thank you. In your latest book, Enlightenment Now, you claim that the world is actually improving and there's never been a safer and better time to be alive. It's obvious that the issue here is that in average things are getting better, but the variance is also increasing, right? Would you say that this applies to countries like Brazil as well, where we see a growing polarization of ideas and a relativization of morals and ethical values? And I mean, of course, this applies to the United States as well. In fact, Brazil, in many ways, mirrors the US process of neo-fascism and fake news production and control of society, in my opinion. Has this idea changed? Your idea of how that things are actually improving, has it changed in the face of the COVID pandemic and the recent movements against racism and totalitarian ideas? What is your opinion about what's going on?
Yes, well, the demonstrations that there have been massive improvements in the human condition does not mean that nothing bad can ever happen again, or that everything gets better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. And I've found that people have no ability to even grasp the concept of progress. Progress being the fact that our life expectancy has increased by 2.5. Deaths in wars have gone down by a factor of more than 20 since the early 1950s. Extreme poverty has declined from 90% of the world's population to 10% of the world's population. Illiteracy has declined from 90% of the world's population to 10% of the world's population. So a lot of things, when you measure them, as opposed to reading the headlines, show that there really has been improvement. But this doesn't mean that this is not magic. It's not a miracle. It doesn't mean that bad things can never happen. It means that in some cases where we have tried to solve problems in the past, we have succeeded. Our ancestors have succeeded. But there are things that have gotten worse, certainly, most obviously the pandemic of the last 3 months. And of course, infectious disease is a constant of the human condition. There have been pandemics since the beginning of recorded history. And clearly the turn in the political sphere toward authoritarian populism, most dramatically in the United States and Brazil, are negative developments. But it's important to realize that this doesn't mean that there has not been progress. It's still true that people are not dying in wars at the rate that they were during the era of the Vietnam War or the Korean War, let alone World War II. It doesn't mean that poverty has not gone down. Now, the reduction in poverty could be threatened by the economic consequences of the pandemic. Again, that's not a contradiction of the idea that there's been progress, but because the reason that there's been progress is that there have been measures that have been taken to solve problems like malnutrition, like infectious disease. If we stop solving problems, the problems will come back.
Do you think that these problems can be solved without acknowledging that the accumulation of capital that allowed actually science to become what it became was done based on slave work by African populations and also by indigenous Native American populations? Do you think that we can we can go to paradise without acknowledging hell first?
We have to acknowledge everything. We have to base our understanding on as complete and accurate a picture as possible. I don't know if there is controversy over how much the slave economy was necessary for the increase in affluence. I suspect that that it was not necessary, that it was exaggerated. We certainly know that Adam Smith, who is the intellectual father of capitalism, was a strong abolitionist and argued that slavery was economically not efficient, and that the parts of the world that eliminated slavery first economically grew the fastest, like Northern Europe, like the Northern United States, as compared to the Southern United States. So slavery was one of the great crimes of humanity, and all of the major civilizations practiced slavery, and often did not get particularly affluent. Whereas the huge growth in affluence starting in the 19th century came around the time that slavery was starting to be abolished. So I'm skeptical of the idea that slavery was necessary for economic growth, but it is a great crime that we have to understand and acknowledge.
Well, we have more time, and I have many questions coming here, but I will allow myself to go a little bit more on this because I think it's fertile. I mean, I hear you, but if you look at when slavery became a big business, was starting in the 15th century when Portugal and then Spain and then France and England and everybody joined it. And it was the major thing going on, slave trade in Africa, towards the Americas, towards Europe, actually, in the beginning, a lot. And that allowed for centuries of accumulation of capital, which later on in the 19th century, eventually financed the Industrial Revolution. I'm not saying it was the same actors because money passes from one hand to another. All the gold and diamonds and emeralds that came from Brazil and all the money accrued through slavery that came from Brazil to Portugal ended up in England, which later on, part of it came to the United States. So I just want to, because I think we're living this particular moment in which people below demand attention to their needs and to the history that took to this situation, right? So my question to you is not whether slavery was lucrative all along. In fact, in Brazil, for example, when slavery was finally abolished in 1888, there was no reparation, and in fact, what the slave owners did was to bring Italian and German workers to substitute the black workforce without any consideration for their situation. So what I question is whether we can move on to a better place without really understanding how did we get so unequal.
Oh, indeed, we ought to understand how where wealth comes from. I think the starting point is to acknowledge that the natural state of humanity is poverty. That poverty doesn't need any explanation. That's just what we're born into. What needs an explanation is wealth, prosperity. Where does it come from? And indeed, economic history, which tries to identify why some countries get rich and other countries get poor, is an essential part of understanding that question. Why did South Korea, for example, go very quickly from being one of the world's poorest countries to one of the richest? Why did Singapore get rich and Taiwan? And England and the Netherlands 150 years before that. I don't think the problem, of course, is that history only happens once, so we can't replay the tape after rewinding it and see what would happen if the Industrial Revolution happened without slavery. So we have to be very indirect and ingenious in answering the question. But I agree, it's a question that has to be addressed and that we should understand.
Thanks, Stephen. Thinking also about the future, not just of linguistics, but also of the world. In this amazing arrival of robots and artificial intelligence. What do you think we can learn from artificial intelligence models for linguistics, and what are the opportunities and pitfalls of this triumphant arrival?
Yes, I think it can be enormously useful to linguistics in answering the question, what is the minimum innate learning machinery that is necessary to acquire a language in the way that children do? And I was surprised, as many people were, by the apparent success of deep learning models, that is, multi-layer artificial neural networks, of the kind that I was involved in a debate in the 1980s and 1990s on whether these models, they used to be called connectionist models, but it's the same as deep learning models, were a good model for human language. And my collaborators and I, Alan Prince, Gary Marcus, Michael Ullman, John Kim, and others argue that there are many linguistic phenomena that cannot be well handled by neural networks. Now we have Google Translate, we have Siri and Alexa, and they do not bad without very much innate structure. The question is, if we were to ask the question, do they use language the way a human does, then if the answer is no, then it might show that we really do need something more specific to language. If the answer is yes, then maybe that the more empiricists approaches were right after all. I suspect that when you probe how these systems work, we'll find out that they are radically different from a human. And the reason is that their actual understanding is very shallow, despite the fact that they're called deep learning. Deep just refers to the number of layers in the neural network. It doesn't refer to conceptual understanding. And since they really just map statistical patterns in the input to statistical patterns in the output without ever constructing a semantic representation, a logical form or conceptual structure, their understanding is pretty much non-existent. And you could probe it by asking hypothetical questions like, did George Washington use a computer? If you ask that, ask any school child, they'll say, well, no, of course not. Computers weren't invented then. If you ask Google or Siri that, you'll get things like George Washington High School computer program, or George Washington University Department of Computer Science, where clearly it's just going by the literal words, but with no comprehension whatsoever of the meaning. Even something like understanding the syntax and semantics of negation. If you ask Siri, give me some fast food restaurants that are not McDonald's, and it'll give you a list, McDonald's, 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 McDonald's. It can't even really parse the not because it doesn't have any syntactic comprehension. So I think it's an excellent theoretical tool for what is understanding of language and what is necessary for a child to acquire understanding of language.
Thanks. Marvin Minsky credited Sigmund Freud for being the first AI theoretician because of his concept of the brain as composed of three major machines. What do you think is the role of psychoanalysis in what's to come in the next decades as the different disciplines grow into each other and merge more and more? What do you think is the role of depth psychology? And even going a little further, do you see any role for Carl Jung's ideas on images as instincts?
Yes, I think Freud was probably not the originator of the idea that the mind is a mechanism. That goes back at least to Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century and to Leibniz, although Freud did believe that the mind is an organic system, that there's no soul or ghost in the machine. Some of Freud's insights, I think, will persist. The idea that most mental activity is unconscious, the idea that we have desires that we must inhibit in order to be functioning members of society, the idea that we often lie to ourselves, we deceive ourselves in order to not acknowledge some of our uglier instincts. But of course, a lot of Freud's ideas, like the Oedipal complex, like penis envy, like a death instinct, thanatos, have no empirical basis at all. And of course, Freud's entire method of just interpreting the free association of patients is not a very scientific approach to understanding the human mind. So I think that aside from some very general insights or observations, that psychoanalysis and depth psychology will not play a major role in the science of mind. And this the same for Jungian archetypes. There may be a grain of truth in the idea that there's certain myths and archetypes and narratives that resonate with the human mind. But Jung was something of a mystic. He, unlike Freud, he did believe in some entity above and beyond the functioning of the brain, some kind of soul or spirit. Like Freud, Jung did not have anything close to a scientific approach of formulating hypotheses that made predictions and testing them against reality.
What is your current take on Chomsky's current hypothesis that merge is all there is to universal grammar, and that all language variation is basically confined to different modes of externalization?
Yes, I think it's unlikely, and Ray Jackendorf and I have made that argument in a paper that came out about 15 years ago in the journal Cognition. That there's a lot of knowledge of language that is neither specific to the external interfaces like speech or production or perception, but that is unmistakably linguistic. The rules of forming a question, of inverting the auxiliary, the rules of verbs selecting their complements, of which verbs have to be tense and which ones don't. There's a huge amount of knowledge that goes into language that is part of our grammar, our knowledge of language. And I don't think that the minimalist program has been worked out in the kind of detail that would actually account for the complexity of language as we use it. The ultimate test would be, could you have a rival to Google Translate or to Siri or Alexa based on minimalist linguistics? And I suspect you could not. Just too vague, and that if you actually fleshed it out, then there'd be a lot of knowledge that goes beyond general principles like procrastinate or economy principles, nor would it be confined to the lexicon unless you weaken the definition of lexicon so that it includes knowledge of grammatical regularities.
These questions are, just to remind you that these questions are all coming from the people that are watching us today. So these few questions. If patterns can be captured in templates with variables, are you considering a construction grammar? And if not, how or in what aspects does your understanding differ from a construction grammar?
It's closely related to a construction grammar, but there has to also be the computational machinery that combines the constructions and replaces the variables with constants, sometimes called unification, where different constraints all get harmonized so that you have a coherent sentence. You can't just have construction, 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 construction. You've got to slot one phrase into the variable of another, and all of that requires a combinatorial machinery. But I suspect that ultimately the insights of construction grammar will play a large role in our best theory of language. I embraced an earlier version of this idea as I was a postdoctoral student of the linguist Joan Bresnan, who proposed in the 1970s a theory called lexical functional grammar. She has still developed variants of that. And that was in some ways similar to construction grammar. Bresnan would actually have the information about constructions in the lexical items, but still they are specific to particular construction types in a language. So I think there's a lot of overlap. So it is an approach that I have long been sympathetic to.
Let's go towards biology. What are your current thoughts about the role of FOXP2 gene in language evolution?
Well, it looks as if the data on when it arose and when it swept the human genome have changed, but it does look as if it was the latest study I saw showed that it seemed to be after our split with the Neanderthals, at least the version that is now universal in humans. I think it was one of probably many genes that were necessary for us to evolve the ability to speak. And the fact that FOXP2, when it is mutated, results in language impairment, but doesn't wipe out language across the board, is consistent with what we know about the genetic basis of all psychological abilities, namely that there is never one gene that gives us a faculty or an ability. There are hundreds or thousands of genes that go into the shaping of an ability. What's unusual about FOXP2 is that it is one gene with a pretty big effect. You can measure the difference between the people who have the mutated version and the regular version, the wild type. With most genetic variants, the difference is much more tiny, and it's usually hundreds or thousands of genes. So I think it did play a role. We know that it's different from the version in great apes. We know that it is not the same as a kind of mutation that just lowers IQ. So I suspect, and we have reason to believe that it was a target of natural selection. Although the manner in which it was selected, new knowledge has changed our understanding, no longer thought to be a recent selective sweep. It may have been a more ancient selective event, but it does seem to have been a target of Darwinian natural selection. Namely, the gene proliferated throughout the human population because it conferred an advantage. We don't know exactly what the advantage is, just knowing that it had one. But given that we know that it makes people more articulate compared to the mutated version, I think it's the simplest hypothesis is that it was selected for expressive power, language ability.
We still have a few minutes, so questions are coming here. People are really thrilled. This one, going back to something you said before, how does your view on the importance of the words rules distinction stand in light of Jack and Duff's model you mentioned, where schemas encompass both idiosyncratic as well as regular information?
Yeah, so I've had this conversation with Ray many times that I think that they're very consistent. Although Ray, I think, has tried to argue against the distinction between words and rules, but I think he's using words and rules in a different sense than the one that I intended. By words, I simply meant things that are memorized, that are arbitrary. By rules, I simply mean a combinatorial apparatus. So a word in the sense that I intended it would include an idiom, would include a construction, would include anything that is not predictable by more general principles. And by rules, I meant whatever combinatorial mental apparatus allows us to produce and understand sequences that we've never heard before. So I think they're completely consistent, but the terminology can be confusing.
Perhaps two more. What should I look for in a child's discourse as they interact with a caregiver or another child? And how do I introduce theorists to back my answer?
Probably theory would not be helpful in the practical goal of helping children to learn the language. Or a question that I often get is, how do I get a child to grow up with 2 languages or 3 languages? If I speak one language, my husband speaks another language, how does a child grow up with both? Because we know that it often happens that when there are, if a child only gets language input from one parent, they'll often force the parent to speak the dominant language of the community and will often not end up with speaking that language, or sometimes only in intimate emotional moments with that parent, but not with full competence. The general answer is peers matter more than parents. That if a child goes away to summer camp or to an after-school program with other children, that's what makes language persist. And I think in the whole literature on language acquisition, I think there's been much too much emphasis on parents, whereas it's peers that are more decisive. Just to give some examples, any immigrant parent knows that the child will grow up with the accent of their peers, not their parents. That's true not just across when a parent speaks the language with an accent as a second language, but even regional variations. Within the United States, the southern US has a different accent than Boston, a different accent than California. And wherever the child grows up, doesn't matter how their parents speak, they copy their peers. And we all know from the process of creolization and sign languages, where we can see in recent historical periods a language develop, it can develop in interactions of kids with other kids without necessarily having input from the top down from parents. So I think that peers are enormously important, particularly when it comes to maintaining a second language.
How do you see the substitution of the computer metaphor of the mind for the complex or dynamic system metaphor of the mind?
Well, I've always resisted the idea that the computer should be a metaphor for the mind. Rather, the mind and computers are 2 examples of computational systems, and that we can understand a lot of mental life by thinking about the ways in which it processes information. We know that a computer also processes information, but it's not that the digital computer is a good metaphor for the mind. An analogy would be, we use the same principles of aerodynamics to understand what keeps a bird in the air and what keeps an airplane in the air. It's the same laws of flight, but that isn't the same as using the airplane as a metaphor for the bird. That would be a big mistake. They have some things in common, other things not in common. Now, of course, dynamical systems, that's not a metaphor at all. That is a mathematical approach. And they're not incompatible because a computational system can change dynamically over time, does change dynamically over time. I suspect that's another example of a false dichotomy.
Thank you very much. People are flooding me with questions, but if you're patient, we can have maybe a couple of short ones and then conclude. What do you think about the idea that one occupies a position in relation to language, a position that dictates our understanding?
I'll try to guess what the question means. Presumably this is a linguist or a scholar trying to make sense of language. Well, if it's a position in the sense, I'm a functionalist, I'm a Chomskyan, I'm a Piagetian, I'm a dynamic systems theorist, it probably gets in the way of understanding, because language is just so vast and complex that a single approach which starts from certain premises is bound to be wrong in some respects. I think we have to be eclectic. We've got to use different data sources, including computational models, data sets of linguistic variation, psychological data on children. I think we have to use different theoretical tools also. The overall Chomskyan goal of characterizing universal grammar, whatever it turns out to be, the more social functional approaches that ask how we use language as human beings to negotiate our relationships and how language might be shaped by those pressures. We have to look at history, how languages change over time. We have to look at computational models of what is capable in principle of acquiring a language or what falls short. We have to use every tool at our disposal. So if a linguist, if a theorist has a position in the sense of one school, that probably gets in the way of the best understanding of language.
Thank you. And then the last one, this is for people to envision their futures. What are the essential skills for the training of psychologists today, in your opinion, either in the academic, experimental, or clinical setting?
Certainly to be eclectic and interdisciplinary, that psychology is not the only field that sheds light on how the mind works. We also have to look at evolution and genetics and neuroscience and anthropology, and of course linguistics and artificial intelligence. So I would advise concentrating on the subject matter, whether it's language or vision or memory or social relations, and bring in many different disciplines that have something to say about that problem, that content. Because the academic disciplines, they're good for deans, for university presidents. They have to build this building, they have to build that building, they have to give students a transcript with different labels. But reality doesn't care about the difference between psychology and linguistics or psychology and computer science, and neither should we ultimately.
Well, Stephen, we're coming to an end. I really want to thank you very much for your time, for this incredible hour that we spent together. And I would invite you to say some concluding remarks to everybody that is watching us now.
I guess my remarks will be to acknowledge we're living through an extraordinarily challenging period in human history, a once-in-a-century pandemic, political polarization, but that our species has solved problems in the past. We have decimated hunger, we have decimated infectious disease, we have reduced extreme poverty, we have reduced autocracy and dictatorship, not to zero, and problems will always persist. But by looking at the ideals of reason and science and humanism, there is a pathway to solving the problems that we now face.
Thank you very much. Godspeed.
Thank you so much to you and to all of the people listening. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for having me on.